The square outside the ceremonial hall had been full since before dawn, chairs set in careful rows facing the raised stone platform where the summoning altar sat waiting under morning light, and by the time the sun cleared the rooftops the crowd had grown thick enough that latecomers stood packed along the back wall craning to see the livestream screens mounted above the stage instead of the stage itself. Every year it was like this. Every 18-year-old in the district would walk up to that altar today, place their hand on its worn stone surface, and find out in front of everyone they had ever known exactly what kind of life they were going to live. Ren stood near the end of the line with his hands loosely at his sides, watching the names get called one after another, watching each new hunter step up, place a palm flat against the altar, and wait the 3 or 4 seconds it took for the ceremonial interface to flare to life above their head, projecting a weapon or an ability class in shimmering blue light that the crowd would either cheer for or murmur over depending on how rare or common the result turned out to be. He had spent the last several weeks trying not to think too hard about what his own result might be, mostly because thinking about it changed nothing. He had no family connections inside any guild, no unusual bloodline anyone had ever mentioned, no reason to expect anything but an ordinary, forgettable outcome. He had made peace with that weeks ago, or told himself he had, the same careful, deliberate kind of peace he made with most things. Not resignation exactly, just an unwillingness to spend energy hoping for something he had no evidence to expect. Ren Kessler, the ceremony official called, and the sound of his own name pulled him forward before he'd fully decided to move. He crossed the platform under the weight of several hundred eyes he didn't know and a scattering of faces he did. Mira from 2 streets over, waving encouragingly, and behind her his old tutor Master Halden watching with the mild, patient attention of a man who had seen 18 years of ceremonies and no longer expected to be surprised by any of them. Ren placed his palm against the altar's cool stone surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Long enough that a ripple of confused murmuring started at the edges of the crowd, long enough that Ren felt the first genuine flicker of concern cut through his composure, not fear of failure exactly, but the specific discomfort of not knowing which direction failure was even coming from. Then the light came, and it was wrong from the very first instant, a deep unstable violet instead of the clean blue every other summon that morning had produced, flickering at the edges like a signal struggling to hold its shape, and out of that unstable light a weapon began to take form above the altar. A long sword, blade dulled and faintly discolored along one edge as though it had been through more use and more damage than any ceremonial summon should carry, its crossguard etched with symbols that had worn nearly smooth with age. The reaction from the crowd did not come as murmuring this time. It came as a sharp collective intake of breath, and then, from somewhere near the front, a voice Ren didn't recognize said the word aloud before anyone official had a chance to control the moment. Cursed. The word moved through the crowd faster than any explanation could have followed it, and within seconds the murmuring had curdled into something closer to open laughter, scattered at first and then spreading, the specific cruel amusement of people who had just watched someone else's worst possible outcome happen in public. Ren stood very still under it, palms still resting against the altar, watching the sword hover above him in its unstable violet light while the ceremony officials on either side of the platform exchanged glances that were not amused at all. One of them, an older woman Ren recognized as one of the district's senior instructors, stepped forward with her expression carefully arranged into something professional, though her eyes carried a flicker of genuine unease she wasn't quite managing to hide. "The Ashkarn blade," she said, loud enough for the recording equipment to catch clearly, the kind of announcement that would be repeated on every district feed by evening. "Summoned." Bonded to Ren Kessler. The laughter did not stop. If anything, the name, the confirmation that this was a known thing, a recognized cursed weapon with its own history rather than some unfortunate malfunction, made it worse, because now people in the crowd were leaning toward each other, repeating the name, some of the older attendees nodding grimly as though they'd been expecting exactly this outcome for exactly this sword for years, just not knowing whose turn it would be. Ren let his hand fall from the altar and the sword solidified fully into his grip, heavier than it looked, its weight settling into his palm with a strange, deliberate certainty, as though it had done this exact thing. Settled into a new hand under the weight of a laughing crowd, more times than anyone standing in that square could count. He did not smile. He did not flinch either. He walked off the platform with the sword held loosely at his side and did not look at any of the faces he passed, not because he couldn't bear to, but because looking would have given the moment more of himself than he was willing to spend on it. Mira caught up with him near the edge of the square, her earlier excitement replaced now with something more careful, more concerned. She started, and then didn't seem to know how to finish it, which was, he thought, probably the most honest response anyone had given him in the last 10 minutes. It's fine, Ren said, and meant it more than she probably believed he did. They're saying it's killed everyone who's ever held it, Mira said quietly. That it just comes back. Every generation. Nobody survives it long. I know what they're saying, Ren said. I heard the same thing you did. He did not go home immediately. Instead he found Master Halden in the thinning crowd near the hall's side entrance, waiting with the patient stillness of someone who had clearly been expecting Ren to come find him rather than the other way around. Walk with me, Halden said, and Ren did, the two of them moving away from the square and its lingering noise toward the quieter streets behind the hall. You know something about it, Ren said. It wasn't a question. I know what everyone my age knows, Halden said. Which is less than you'd think, and more than anyone's willing to say plainly in front of a crowd. He was quiet for a few steps, choosing his words the way he always had when Ren was younger and asking questions his other tutors preferred to wave away. That sword has been summoned before. Not once. Many times. Across generations, as far back as anyone's kept proper records. Every time, the wielder dies using it, within a handful of years at most, sometimes far sooner. And every time, the sword simply returns to the summoning pool, waiting for the altar to choose someone new. Why does it keep getting chosen at all, if that's its history? Because the altar doesn't choose based on history, Halden said. It chooses based on some resonance nobody's ever fully understood. As far as the ceremony's concerned, that sword is simply available, same as any other weapon in the pool, and eventually it comes up. It's not supposed to seek out unlucky candidates. It's supposed to be neutral. He paused. For what it's worth, I don't think it is neutral. I think there's something about the way it keeps returning to the pool instead of being retired that nobody's ever bothered to ask questions about, because everyone's too busy being afraid of it to study it. Ren turned that over in his mind as they walked. Has anyone ever actually figured out what it does? Not the story about it being cursed. What it actually does. Halden shook his head slowly. Not that I've ever heard. Every wielder who might have found something out died before they could tell anyone, or didn't notice anything worth telling. It's always been treated as a punishment, Ren, not a puzzle. Maybe that's the problem, Ren said, mostly to himself, and Halden gave him a long, measuring look that suggested he'd heard exactly what Ren meant by it and wasn't sure whether to be worried or reassured. Ren spent that evening alone in his small apartment with the sword laid flat across his kitchen table, studying it the way he might have studied anything else he didn't yet understand, patiently, without assuming his first read of it would be correct. The blade itself, up close, carried faint discolorations along its length that didn't look like simple rust or age, more like old scarring, a pattern that repeated in slightly different configurations depending on where along the edge he looked, as though the metal itself had been marked by something more specific than time. When he finally reached out and gripped the hilt properly, intending simply to test its balance, the ceremonial interface flared to life again without warning, hovering in his vision the way it had briefly at the altar, except this time, alone in his apartment with no crowd and no pressure to perform, Ren let it run instead of stepping back from it. What displayed was not a single class name, not a rank, not any of the clean simple readouts he'd watched flash above a dozen other summoners that same morning. Instead the interface glitched and fractured, layers of text overlapping in a way that made his vision ache trying to parse it, fragments of names and numbers and ability designations stacking on top of each other faster than he could read any single one clearly, the whole display shuddering like a system straining under information it had never been built to categorize. He sat with it for a long time, not trying to force understanding, just watching, the same patient attention he'd have given any unfamiliar problem, until gradually he started to notice that the glitching wasn't random. Certain fragments repeated. Certain designations flickered to the surface more than once before submerging back into the chaotic overlay, as though the interface were cycling through discrete, separate entries rather than displaying one badly corrupted result. It wasn't broken, he realized slowly. It was full. The thought settled into him with a strange, cold clarity, and he spent the rest of that night simply sitting with the sword, testing small deliberate inputs, focusing his attention on one flickering fragment at a time instead of letting his eyes slide across the whole overwhelming mess, and by the early hours of the morning he managed, for just a moment, to isolate a single thread of the display and hold it still. A name flashed clear for the first time. Not his own. A rank designation beside it, low tier, unremarkable, the kind of hunter classification that wouldn't have drawn any particular attention in life. Beneath the name, a short combat technique description, simple and functional, clearly belonging to whoever that name had once been. Ren stared at it until the interface finally destabilized again and the fragment dissolved back into the churning overlay, and he sat back from the table with his heart beating harder than the moment probably should have warranted, because he understood, with a certainty that didn't need further proof, exactly what Halden had said no one had ever figured out. Every person who had ever died wielding this sword hadn't simply been erased into whatever curse the stories described. They'd been kept. Stored, layered one on top of another inside the blade itself, their ranks and their techniques accumulating instead of vanishing, generation after generation, and nobody, not the terrified instructors, not the whispering crowds, not even the previous wielders themselves, dying too fast or too confused to notice what was actually happening to them, had ever lived long enough or looked closely enough to realize the curse wasn't a curse at all. It was an archive. He didn't sleep that night. By morning he had a working theory and no way to test it safely, which was, he supposed, exactly the problem every previous wielder must have run into eventually, except none of them had apparently survived long enough to solve it the way he intended to. His new hunter assignment arrived 2 days later, delivered by district courier along with everyone else's from his ceremony cohort, and Ren wasn't surprised in the slightest to find his name attached to the lowest available gate rotation, grouped with 3 other new hunters whose ceremony results had similarly unimpressed the assignment board. Nobody expected much from a cohort like this. Nobody expected much from him specifically, given what the entire district now knew about the weapon strapped to his back, and the quiet, private amusement he felt at that expectation gap was the first genuinely warm feeling he'd had since the ceremony. The gate itself sat at the district's northern perimeter, a modest tear in the world rated for low-threat monster activity, exactly the kind of assignment meant to ease new hunters into fieldwork without any real risk of losing them in their first month. Ren's cohort, 2 nervous 18-year-olds named Tobin and Yuna, and an older instructor named Garrick assigned to supervise them. Gathered at the gate's threshold that morning with the kind of forced camaraderie people built quickly when they were about to walk into danger together for the first time. Stay close, watch your footing, and let the sword do the work if it comes to that, Garrick told Ren directly, with a look that suggested he still wasn't entirely sure what he thought about assigning a cursed weapon to field duty on his watch. First sign of trouble beyond a low-tier skirmish, we pull back. Understood? Understood, Ren said, and meant it, though not quite in the way Garrick intended. The gate's interior was unremarkable at first, low scrubland stretching under a flat gray sky that didn't match the weather outside, monster activity minimal enough that the first 20 minutes passed in relative calm, Tobin and Yuna handling a pair of weak scavenger-type creatures with the clumsy but functional technique typical of brand-new hunters testing their summoned abilities for the first time in the field. It went wrong the way low-tier gates occasionally did, without warning, when the ground ahead of them split open unexpectedly and something considerably larger than anything on the gate's threat assessment climbed out of it, a broad-shouldered creature covered in overlapping bone plating that Garrick immediately recognized well enough to pale. "That's not supposed to be in here," he said, already pulling Tobin and Yuna back by the shoulders. "That's a mid-tier breach anomaly, we need to fall back now." The creature moved before any of them could retreat cleanly, a lunge that caught Yuna across the shoulder hard enough to throw her sideways into the scrub, and Garrick's own summoned weapon, a serviceable but unremarkable short spear, was already in his hands as he stepped between the creature and his two younger charges. Ren didn't think about it as a decision so much as a fact that had already resolved itself the moment Yuna hit the ground. He was moving before Garrick finished shouting for him to hold position, sword drawn, and as the creature's attention swung toward him he felt, for the first time outside the quiet controlled testing of his kitchen table, the ceremonial interface flicker open across his vision mid-motion, fragments cycling faster than before, urgency apparently sharpening whatever process let him access them. He didn't have time to isolate anything carefully. He simply reached, the way he'd practiced reaching in his apartment, and felt something surface and settle into his grip alongside the sword's normal weight, not a new weapon, not a transformation, just a sudden, unfamiliar certainty in his own body about how to move, muscle memory that wasn't his own arriving fully formed in a half-second before the creature's next attack landed. He used it without understanding it, sidestepping a blow that should have caught him squarely, blade finding a gap in the bone plating along the creature's foreleg with a precision his own untrained instincts couldn't have produced on their own. The creature staggered, and Ren felt the borrowed technique fade as quickly as it had come, replaced by his own uncertain footing scrambling to keep pace with a fight he was still fundamentally learning in real time. "Kessler, fall back," Garrick was shouting, spear raised, positioning to intercept, but Ren reached for the interface again instead, deliberately this time, and felt a second fragment answer the pull, different from the first, heavier, a defensive stance that dropped his center of gravity and angled the blade in a way that let him absorb the creature's next lunge along the flat instead of taking it edge-on, the impact jarring up his arm but not breaking his grip. Between the two of them, Ren and Garrick wore the creature down, Tobin dragging Yuna clear and providing what covering support his own low-tier ability allowed, and by the time the creature finally collapsed, bleeding out from the accumulated damage of a fight none of them had trained for, Ren was breathing hard, sword arm trembling, and aware, in a distant analytical corner of his mind even through the adrenaline, that he had just consciously pulled two separate borrowed techniques out of the blade under genuine pressure and both had worked exactly as needed. Garrick stared at him afterward with an expression that had shifted somewhere between suspicion and reluctant respect. "That last stance," he said slowly. "Where did you learn that? That's not a first-month technique. That's not anything I've seen taught in this district at all." "I didn't learn it," Ren said, which was true, and left it there, because he wasn't ready yet to explain what he actually meant by it, not to Garrick, not to anyone standing in a gate less than an hour after he'd first proven the theory to himself under real stakes instead of quiet controlled testing. Back at the extraction point, while Yuna's shoulder was being treated and Tobin recounted the fight in the breathless, exaggerated way new hunters always did after their first real scare, Ren sat slightly apart from the group with the sword across his knees, running his thumb slowly along one of the faint discolored scars etched into its blade, and let the interface flicker open one more time, calmer now, no longer under the pressure of combat. He isolated a fragment carefully, the way he had that first night, and held it steady long enough to read it fully this time. A name. A rank designation, mid-tier, respectable. A technique description matching almost exactly the defensive stance that had just saved his shoulder from a bone-plated lunge. And beneath it, smaller, something he hadn't noticed in his first read of any previous fragment, a date. A death date, he realized slowly, cross-referencing the timeline against what little he already knew of the sword's history, and the date lined up almost precisely with a name he vaguely recognized from a district memorial plaque he'd walked past 100 times without ever really reading it, a hunter listed as lost to an unspecified field accident several years before Ren had even been born. He sat with that for a long moment, the fight's adrenaline finally draining out of him and leaving something colder and more deliberate in its place, because a field accident, he was beginning to suspect, was not always simply an accident, and a sword that had quietly outlived every single person who had ever wielded it long enough to matter was not, he was now certain, an object anyone should have been comfortable leaving unexamined for as many generations as it apparently had been. The names did not stop at one. Over the following week, in the quiet hours after his cohort's gate rotations ended, Ren returned again and again to the sword laid flat across his kitchen table, learning slowly how to steady the fractured interface long enough to pull single threads free from the churning overlay, and each thread he isolated carried the same pattern. A name, a rank, a technique, and beneath it, smaller than the rest, a date that always resolved into a death he could, with enough digging through district memorial records, eventually confirm. 11 names, by the end of that week. 11 confirmed deaths stretching back further than he'd expected, the earliest dated almost 60 years prior, the most recent barely 4 years old. 11 hunters whose official records, when Wren found time between assignments to search the district archive terminal at the guild hall, all carried some version of the same bloodless phrasing. Field accident. Cause undetermined. Lost during routine gate clearance. None of them mentioned the sword by name. That detail alone told Wren more than the deaths themselves did, because if the Ashkarn blade had genuinely been responsible for 11 deaths across 60 years, in a district small enough that everyone already whispered its reputation at a ceremony, someone should have connected those names publicly at some point. The fact that nobody had, that each death sat isolated in its own quiet paragraph with no cross-reference to any of the others, suggested to Wren that the connection had been deliberately left unmade, not simply overlooked. He brought this, carefully and without full explanation, to Master Halden on the 7th evening, laying out the pattern of dates and ranks without yet telling him how he'd actually obtained the information. Halden read through Wren's handwritten list twice before setting it down, his expression harder than Wren had seen it in years. Where did you get these names? Does it matter, if they're accurate? It matters a great deal, Wren. Halden's voice had dropped, the careful, measured tone of a man choosing to be direct instead of protective. Because if you found 11 deaths tied to that sword that nobody else has ever connected, then either you're the first person clever enough to notice a pattern that's been sitting in public records for 60 years, which I doubt, given how many people have had reason to look closely at that weapon's history, or somebody made very sure this pattern stayed invisible, and you've just made yourself considerably more interesting to that somebody than you were a week ago. Wren didn't answer immediately, because he'd already reached the same conclusion on his own and hadn't wanted to hear it confirmed out loud quite so plainly. I'd be careful who else you show that list to, Halden said. Careful, and quiet, until you understand more than you do right now. Wren took the warning seriously enough to stop discussing it openly, but not seriously enough to stop investigating, and 2 days later, during a routine cohort debrief at the guild hall, he found himself the subject of an unscheduled visit that told him Halden's instinct about being interesting to somebody had already proven correct faster than either of them expected. The man who found him waiting outside the debrief room introduced himself as Director Wren Castellan, a name Wren recognized vaguely from district oversight announcements, someone whose actual job function had never been explained clearly to any new hunter but who apparently held enough authority that Garrick, passing through the hallway at the same moment, stopped mid-stride and inclined his head with visible deference before continuing on. Wren Kessler, Castellan said, in a tone that managed to sound both warm and carefully controlled at once. I understand your first gate rotation was eventful. It went well, considering, Wren said. So I've heard. A mid-tier breach anomaly, handled by a brand new cohort without a single serious injury. Remarkable, for hunters barely a week into fieldwork. Castellan's eyes moved briefly to the sword at Wren's side, a glance that lingered half a second longer than casual curiosity would explain. The Ashkarn blade has quite a reputation in this district. I confess I was surprised to hear it performed so capably in your hands. It's an unusual weapon, Wren said carefully. Unusual, Castellan repeated, as though testing the word for weight. Yes. I imagine it is. He smiled, thin and brief. The District Oversight Board keeps informal records on all curse designation summons, purely for safety monitoring purposes. I'd be curious to hear more about your experience with it sometime, when you have leisure for a proper conversation. Nothing urgent. He paused at the doorway on his way out, and added, almost as an afterthought that Wren didn't believe was an afterthought at all, do be careful with that sword, Hunter Kessler. Objects with histories like that one tend to attract more attention than young hunters generally expect. He left before Ren could formulate a response that revealed nothing, and Ren stood in the empty hallway afterward, turning the exchange over in his mind, aware that Castellan's warning had carried the exact same shape as an actual threat, wearing the language of concern, the same practiced smoothness Halden had described when he'd talked, years ago in an unrelated conversation, about how people with something to protect rarely announced their protection as protection. He did not mention the visit to Halden immediately, partly because he wanted more information before raising his old tutor's concern further, and partly because some careful, patient instinct told him the next real answers weren't going to come from conversations in Guildhall hallways. They were going to come from the sword itself, and from whatever it had absorbed from the 11 names he'd already confirmed, if he could just learn to hold the interface steady long enough to pull more than fragments. That night he tried something he hadn't attempted before. Instead of isolating a single thread and letting the rest dissolve back into the overlay, he tried to hold 2 threads at once, forcing his attention to split rather than narrow, a technique that gave him a splitting headache within minutes but eventually, on the 4th attempt, produced something he hadn't seen yet. 2 fragments held steady side by side revealed a connection neither displayed alone. 2 of the 11 names, separated by nearly 20 years in their death dates, shared an identical final entry in their stored technique logs, a specific defensive maneuver logged in both records within days of their respective deaths, as though something about the circumstances surrounding their final battles had been similar enough that both hunters had reached for the exact same desperate solution. Ren sat with that discovery long past midnight, exhausted from the effort of holding the split focus, and slowly built a working theory that felt less like paranoia and more like the only explanation that actually fit everything he'd found. If 2 hunters 20 years apart had died using nearly identical last resort techniques against threats severe enough to kill them despite that technique, it suggested those deaths hadn't been ordinary field accidents at all. It suggested both of them had been placed, deliberately, or through circumstances engineered to look accidental, into situations calibrated to be just survivable enough that a skilled hunter would fight desperately, and just lethal enough that the fight would end in death regardless of skill. Someone had been using this sword as more than a weapon. Someone had been using it as a harvesting mechanism, feeding it capable hunters under controlled conditions, letting their deaths compound the archive inside the blade generation after generation, and then quietly resetting the sword back into the summoning pool once the harvest was complete, waiting for the altar to hand it to the next unsuspecting 18-year-old. The thought settled into him with the same cold, deliberate anger he'd felt reading the terminal logs in a dungeon he hadn't yet walked into, in a version of this life he hadn't yet lived, and though he had no memory of any such thing, the certainty in his chest felt exactly as old and exactly as earned. His next gate assignment came 4 days later, upgraded unexpectedly from low-tier to mid-tier without explanation, a change in his rotation schedule that Garrick relayed to him with visible confusion of his own. Above my authority to explain, Garrick admitted. Came down directly from oversight. You've been reassigned to a mixed cohort, more experienced hunters, gate rated considerably higher than what a week 1 assignment should carry. I flagged it as unusual. Got told it was already approved. Ren understood immediately, without needing anyone to spell it out, that Castellan's warm, careful conversation in the guild hall hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the beginning of a test. An attempt to place him somewhere the odds would no longer favor a first-week hunter, somewhere a convenient accident might plausibly occur, exactly the kind of controlled, survivable but not really scenario his theory suggested had claimed at least 2 of the 11 names already confirmed. He went anyway, because refusing would only confirm he suspected something, and because some steady, settled part of him had already decided that if this was the mechanism that had been quietly killing hunters and harvesting them for decades, the only way to actually stop it was to survive being fed into it himself, deliberately, with his eyes open in a way none of the 11 names before him apparently ever had. The mixed cohort gate sat 2 districts over, rated for threats well above anything Ren's actual field experience should have prepared him for, and the 4 hunters he was paired with, all older, all considerably more seasoned, greeted his presence with the same confused skepticism Garrick had shown, none of them having been given any real explanation for why a week-old hunter with a cursed weapon had been slotted into their rotation. The threat, when it arrived less than 30 minutes into the gate's interior, was not a natural escalation of the environment's rated difficulty. It arrived too precisely, too suddenly, a coordinated pack of mid-tier predators converging on their position from 3 directions simultaneously in a pattern too deliberate to be random monster behavior, and Ren understood, watching it unfold, that whoever had arranged this rotation had arranged the threat as well, whether through direct manipulation of the gate's monster density or through information leaked to something inside it that recognized coordinated targets when it was given them. He fought harder in the next several minutes than he had in his entire life, reaching into the sword's archive again and again under pressure severe enough that he stopped being able to isolate single fragments cleanly, techniques bleeding into each other, borrowed instincts overlapping with his own until he could no longer entirely tell where the archive's contributions ended and his own developing skill began, and somewhere in the chaos of that fight, as one of the older hunters went down hard under a predator that had specifically isolated her from the group, Ren felt something shift inside the sword itself, a pressure building beneath the fractured interface that hadn't been there in any of his previous tests, that he didn't understand it fully in the moment. He understood only that when he finally drove the blade through the last predator's throat, breathing hard, the interface flared open one final time unprompted, without his deliberate reaching, and displayed, clean and unfractured for the first time since the ceremony, a single readout he hadn't earned through patient isolation. Archive threshold reached. New function available. He stared at it, chest heaving, the fallen hunter being helped up behind him, and understood, with the same cold certainty that had carried him through every discovery so far, that whatever the sword had been quietly building toward across 60 years and 11 confirmed deaths, it had just decided he'd survived long enough to be shown the next piece of it. And that whoever had engineered this gate assignment to kill him quietly was about to find out, very shortly, exactly how badly that plan had failed. Ren stood in the settling quiet of the gate's interior with the sword still raised, the predator's body cooling at his feet, and the interface hovering unfractured in his vision in a way it had never done before. Archive threshold reached. New function available. Beneath the words, when he focused hard enough to steady his breathing and actually parse what he was looking at, a second line resolved into clarity. Synthesis unlocked. Combine stored techniques at will. He didn't have time to test it properly. The older hunter who'd gone down, a woman named Dessa with 20 years of field experience and a graze along her ribs that was bleeding more than she wanted to admit, was already back on her feet insisting she was fine while the rest of the cohort regrouped around the kill site, and the immediate business of confirming everyone was alive and mobile took priority over anything the sword was offering him. But he filed it away carefully, the way he filed away everything the blade showed him now, because a function called synthesis, arriving at the exact moment he'd survived what he was increasingly certain had been an engineered attempt on his life, felt less like a coincidence and more like the archive itself recognizing that patient testing wasn't going to be enough anymore. The extraction back through the gate was tense in a way that had nothing to do with monsters. Dessa kept glancing at him sideways, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful reassessment of someone recalculating what she thought she knew about the new hunter she'd been paired with that morning. The 2 other seasoned hunters in the cohort, a broad quiet man named Faro and a sharp-eyed younger woman named Ilsa, exchanged a look between themselves that Ren caught but didn't comment on, the kind of look people gave each other when they'd all just survived something that shouldn't have happened to a cohort of their supposed skill level. That wasn't a normal pack formation, Ilsa said finally, once they'd cleared the gate threshold and stood blinking in the ordinary daylight of the extraction point. Predators like that don't coordinate 3-directional convergence unless something's herding them into it. I noticed the same thing, Ren said carefully. You noticed, Faro repeated, not quite a question, studying Ren with the flat, assessing patience of a man who'd been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone was choosing their words around a larger truth. New hunter, week 1, notices tactical predator coordination before 3 field veterans finish processing what just happened to us. I've had a strange week, Ren said, which was true enough not to feel like a lie, and left it there. Dessa's ribs turned out to need actual attention, which meant the cohort's return to the guild hall came with a mandatory medical stop, and Ren used the delay to slip away long enough to find Halden before Castellan's office could summon him for whatever debrief was inevitably coming. He found his old tutor in the small reading room behind the district archive terminal, and told him everything this time, the 11 names, the shared technique between two deaths 20 years apart, the reassignment to a mid-tier gate no week 1 hunter should have received, the coordinated predator attack that had felt engineered rather than random, and finally, the interface's unprompted flare afterward. Holden listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively more grim, and when Wren finished, he sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "You understand what you're describing," he said. "You're describing a system that's been operating for 60 years, feeding hunters into a weapon to harvest their abilities, run by someone with enough authority inside district oversight to arrange gate assignments and monster density without triggering any review." "I understand it," Wren said. "Then you understand you're not equipped to confront that alone." "Not yet. Whatever new function the sword just gave you, you don't know what it costs, or what it does under pressure you haven't tested it against." "I know that too," Wren said. "But if I wait until I feel equipped, Castellan gets another attempt, and the next one might not be as clumsy as sending me into a gate with a suspicious cohort assignment. I'd rather learn what the sword can do on my own terms, before he decides to try something less traceable." Holden studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from concern into a kind of resigned respect, the look of a man watching someone he taught become exactly as stubborn as he'd once been himself. "Then learn carefully," he said. "And run. Whatever the synthesis function turns out to be, do not test it for the first time in front of anyone who might report what they see back to oversight. Whatever advantage you have right now is built entirely on nobody outside the two of us understanding what that sword actually does. The moment that changes, you lose whatever head start you've got." Wren spent the following 3 nights doing exactly that, alone in his apartment with the door locked and the sword laid across his kitchen table, working through the synthesis function with the same patient, methodical care he'd used to first isolate the archive's individual fragments. It did not work the way he expected. Combining 2 stored techniques wasn't a simple matter of layering them together. The interface required him to hold both fragments steady simultaneously, the same exhausting split focus that had cost him a headache the first time he'd attempted it, and then consciously will them to merge rather than simply coexist, a process that failed completely on his first 11 attempts and produced only a violent feedback pulse that left his hand aching each time. Against his own kitchen wall, genuinely new rather than simply borrowed. It was small. It was also proof, and proof was what he needed most right now, more than power, because proof meant this wasn't going to stay a secret indefinitely if he kept using it, and he needed to understand exactly what he was building before Castellan's next move forced his hand. The summons from oversight came on the 4th day, formal this time rather than the casual hallway conversation Castellan had used before, a written notice requiring Wren's presence at the district oversight office to discuss, in the notice's carefully bloodless phrasing, matters pertaining to curse designation weapon safety monitoring. He went with Holden's warning fresh in his mind and told no one where he was actually going, having quietly informed Garrick beforehand, in a conversation phrased carefully enough not to sound paranoid, that if he wasn't back to check in by evening, someone should know his last confirmed location had been Castellan's office. Castellan received him in a room considerably more private than the Guildhall hallway, no recording equipment visible, no assistants present, just the 2 of them across a wide desk and the particular quality of silence that came from a man who had already decided exactly how this conversation was going to go before it started. "You've had an eventful few weeks, Hunter Kessler," Castellan said, without preamble. "A mid-tier breach anomaly in your first rotation. An unusually coordinated predator convergence in your second, mixed cohort assignment, both survived without loss of life, which I confess surprises me a great deal more than it probably should, given what I understand about that sword's typical outcomes." "I've been fortunate," Wren said. "Fortune," Castellan repeated, the same testing tone he'd used with the word unusual weeks earlier. "I don't believe in fortune that consistent, Hunter Kessler. I believe in patterns. And I've been in this position long enough to recognize when a pattern is forming that I don't yet fully understand." He leaned forward slightly. "I'll be direct with you, since subtlety hasn't served either of us particularly well so far. I'd like to know what you've discovered about that weapon. Not rumors. Not district folklore. What you, personally, have learned. Ren held his gaze and said nothing for a long moment, weighing the risk of every possible answer, and settled finally on something close enough to true to hold under scrutiny without giving away the full shape of what he actually knew. I've learned it's not simply cursed, he said. I think it stores something from the people who've died using it. I haven't fully understood what, or why. Something flickered across Castellan's face, brief and controlled, but Ren caught it, the specific tightness of a man recalculating how much damage had already been done. That's a significant claim, Castellan said carefully. One I'd advise you not to repeat outside this room until it's been properly verified by oversight. Why, Ren said, would district oversight want to control what I say about a weapon's function, rather than simply investigate it themselves? The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, too long to be casual, and in that silence Ren understood, with total certainty, that he was no longer speaking to a man who was uncertain what the sword did. He was speaking to a man who already knew exactly what it did, and was now working out precisely how much Ren had already figured out for himself. Because, Castellan said finally, his voice dropping into something quieter and considerably less warm than his earlier tone, some patterns are older and more carefully managed than a weak one hunter is equipped to understand, and I would strongly encourage you, Hunter Kessler, to consider whether you actually want to keep pulling on this particular thread. Is that a warning, Ren said, or a confession? Castellan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the look of a man who had just decided that the conversation he'd hoped to have was no longer the conversation he was going to get, and that whatever came next would require a different approach entirely. Consider it advice, Castellan said. Freely given, and unlikely to be offered twice. Ren left the office with his pulse steady and his mind working faster than it had at any point since the ceremony, because Castellan's reaction had told him more in 5 seconds of silence than any document search could have. This wasn't a rogue director acting alone the way Song had been in another version of a story he had no memory of but somehow understood in his bones anyway. Castellan was protecting something structural, an arrangement old enough and careful enough that even a direct accusation hadn't produced denial, only redirection. He found Halden again that evening and relayed the conversation in full, and Halden listened with the particular grimness of a man whose worst suspicions were being confirmed one careful sentence at a time. You've made yourself a problem he can't easily solve quietly anymore, Halden said. Which means his options are narrowing. He can't simply arrange another accident now, not after this conversation, not with me aware of your movements and likely others watching more closely given what happened in that last gate. That leaves him with slower, more careful methods. Isolation. Discrediting. Making sure nobody believes you if you do finally say something publicly. Or, Ren said, he escalates, and decides a hunter smart enough to have this conversation with him is too dangerous to leave functioning at all, regardless of how it looks. Halden didn't argue the point, because they both understood it was equally possible, and the two of them sat with that uncertainty for a long moment before Halden finally spoke again, quieter now, more careful. There's something I should have told you sooner, he said. I didn't, because I wasn't certain it was relevant, and because some of it isn't entirely mine to share. But given where this has gone, I think you need to hear it. He paused, choosing his words with visible effort. The 10th name on your list. The one from roughly 15 years ago. I knew her, Ren. Not well, but I knew her. Her name was Corin Vass, and she wasn't simply a hunter who died in a field accident. She was investigating something before she died. Something about weapon oversight and unusual gate assignment patterns. I never knew the specifics. I only know she came to me once, uneasy about a reassignment she'd received that didn't sit right with her, very much the way yours didn't sit right with you 3 days ago. 2 weeks later, she was dead, and the official record closed the matter as an unfortunate field accident within days, faster than any similar case I'd seen before or since. Ren felt something cold and precise settle into place in his chest, the shape of a pattern completing itself with a piece he hadn't known he was missing. You think she found the same thing I'm finding now? I think, Halden said carefully, that you are not the first person clever enough to notice this. You may simply be the first person who survived long enough afterward to keep noticing. The weight of that sat between them for a long moment, and Ren found himself turning the sword over in his mind, the archive of 11 confirmed names now potentially widening to include a 12th who had never actually wielded the blade at all, someone who had simply gotten too close to understanding what it did and paid for that understanding the same way its actual wielders eventually had. He thought about the synthesis function, still barely tested, still unpredictable under real pressure, and understood that whatever came next in this fight, he would very likely be facing it with considerably less time to prepare than he wanted, because a man like Castellan, having failed once to arrange a quiet accidental death and having now had his careful redirection met with an accusation sharp enough to rattle him, was not the kind of man who would simply wait patiently to see what Ren did next. That night, alone again with the sword and the exhausting work of forcing fragments to merge, Ren pushed the synthesis function harder than he had before, chasing not small efficient improvements but something closer to what he'd need if Castellan's next move turned out to be direct rather than another carefully engineered accident, and somewhere past midnight, on an attempt that cost him more than any before it, 2 of the archive's stronger fragments finally folded together into something that made the interface flare bright and hold steady in a way it never had, a combined technique carrying weight and precision neither original fragment had possessed alone. He sat back from the table afterward, exhausted, hand trembling faintly, and understood that he had just built, for the first time, something that belonged to him rather than to any of the 11 names who'd come before him, assembled from their deaths but no longer simply borrowed from them, and that whatever Castellan decided to do next, Ren intended to make certain it would be considerably harder to arrange than the last quiet, deniable attempt had been. 3 days passed without any further contact from Castellan's office, which unsettled Ren more than an immediate response would have, because silence from a man who had just been accused to his face of overseeing a decades-long harvesting operation was not the silence of someone backing down. It was the silence of someone recalculating. He used those 3 days carefully. Between his assigned gate rotations, which Garrick had quietly shifted back to appropriately low-tier assignments without ever explaining why, Ren returned to the district archive terminal at every opportunity, this time searching specifically for Corin Vass rather than combing blindly through decades of memorial records. Her file, when he finally located it buried under a research classification rather than the standard Hunter registry, told him more than he expected. She hadn't simply been a field hunter. She'd held a position inside District Oversight's own internal review division, the exact department responsible for auditing gate assignment patterns and weapon safety monitoring, which meant she hadn't stumbled onto the pattern by accident the way Ren had. She'd had direct access to the records that would have made the pattern visible far faster than anything he'd managed to piece together on his own. Her death record listed the same bloodless phrasing as the 11 names before her. Field accident. Cause undetermined. But appended to her file, buried in a section Ren almost missed entirely, was a single administrative note dated 4 days before her death, transferring her out of internal review and into an unrelated field rotation, signed off by an authorization code Ren didn't recognize until he cross-referenced it against the district's oversight directory and found it belonged to an office that, 15 years ago, had been held by a man 2 positions junior to where Castellan now sat. Not Castellan himself, but close enough to the same chain of authority that Ren felt the pattern solidify into something structural rather than personal, exactly as Halden had warned. This wasn't one man protecting one secret. This was a position, inherited and maintained across at least 2 office holders, each one apparently understanding what needed protecting without necessarily needing to be told outright by the one before them. He brought this to Halden that evening, and his old tutor's face went carefully blank in the specific way Ren had learned meant Halden was more frightened than he wanted to show. That authorization code. Halden said slowly. You're certain of it? I cross-referenced it twice. That office, Halden said, has existed under different names and slightly different jurisdictions for as long as I've been alive, Ren. It predates Castellan. It predates whoever held it before him. If what you're suggesting is true, this isn't a corrupt director exploiting a cursed weapon for personal gain. This is an institution that has been quietly managing that sword's harvest as a matter of policy, for reasons neither of us currently understands, and Corin Vass's death 15 years ago was very likely not the first time someone inside that structure decided a threat to the arrangement needed to be removed before it became a public problem. The word institution sat heavier in the room than anything Halden had said before, and Wren understood that whatever he'd initially believed he was fighting, one frightened, self-interested official trying to cover up a personal failure, had just widened into something considerably larger and older. A machine built with enough deliberate design that it had survived at least 60 years and multiple changes of leadership without ever once being exposed. Why, Wren asked quietly, would an institution want Hunter's abilities harvested into a single sword? What would they even do with an archive like that? Halden didn't have an answer, and the not knowing seemed to bother him almost as much as the pattern itself. I don't know, he admitted. But I think you need to find out before you decide your next move, because right now you're operating on the assumption that stopping this means exposing one corrupt man. If it's an institution instead, exposure might not stop anything at all. It might simply make you the next name they need to remove before you can tell anyone what you found. That warning followed Wren through the rest of the week, sharpening rather than fading, and on his next scheduled gate rotation, a routine low-tier assignment that Garrick had specifically requested to keep Wren's field exposure minimal while things settled. Wren found himself distracted enough during the debrief beforehand that Garrick pulled him aside afterward with visible concern. You've been somewhere else all week, Garrick said. I don't need to know where, but I need you focused when you're in that gate. Distracted hunters get hurt, cursed sword or not. I'll be focused, Wren said, and meant it, though the effort it took to actually deliver on that promise once he stood at the gate threshold surprised him. The rotation itself passed without incident, low-tier threats handled competently by his cohort, and it was only on the walk back from the extraction point that Wren noticed the man waiting near the guild hall's side entrance, positioned with the deliberate casualness of someone who wanted to look like he was simply passing through rather than waiting specifically for Wren to arrive. He was younger than Castellan, dressed in the plain unmarked clothing of someone who'd made a point of not wearing anything identifiable, and when he fell into step beside Wren without introduction, Wren's hand moved instinctively toward the sword at his hip before the man raised both palms in a gesture of open, unthreatening surrender. I'm not here to hurt you, the man said quietly, glancing once toward the guild hall's entrance before continuing. My name is Farrell. I used to work in internal review, same division Corin Vass worked in before she died. I've been watching what's happened to you over the last few weeks, and I think we should talk somewhere less visible than a guild hall entrance. Wren studied him carefully, weighing every possible reason this could be a trap arranged by Castellan to draw him somewhere isolated, and found, beneath the caution, a genuine flicker of curiosity strong enough to outweigh the risk. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, not yet, Farrell said. But I knew Corin. I was the one who found her research notes after she died, before anyone in the office thought to look for them, and I've spent 15 years sitting on what I found because I didn't have proof solid enough to survive making it public, and because everyone who'd looked closely at that pattern before me ended up the same way she did. He held Wren's gaze steadily. You're the first person in 15 years who's gotten this far and survived long enough for me to reach out. I'd like to show you what she found, if you're willing to hear it. Wren thought of Halden's warning, of Castellan's careful silence over the last 3 days, of the widening shape of an institution rather than a single corrupt man, and decided that whatever risk this conversation carried, refusing it meant continuing to operate on incomplete information against an opponent who clearly wasn't going to stay quiet for much longer. Where, Wren said. Farrell led him not toward anywhere secretive or dramatic, but to an unremarkable tea house 3 streets from the guild hall, crowded enough with ordinary conversation that their own would blend in rather than stand out, and once they were seated in a corner booth with 2 cups neither of them touched, Farrell finally produced a small data drive from an inside pocket and slid it across the table. Corin's notes, he said. Everything she'd gathered before her transfer order came through. I've kept a copy hidden for 15 years, waiting for someone with a reason strong enough to actually use it. Wren didn't open it there, not in a public tea house, but Farrell talked him through the substance of it in low, careful sentences instead. Corin's research had gone further than Ren's own patchwork investigation, not because she'd had access to the sword itself, but because she'd had access to the Oversight Division's older archives, records dating back decades that had since been reclassified or quietly removed from general circulation. What she'd found wasn't simply a pattern of engineered deaths feeding an archive weapon. She'd found the original authorization, over a century old, establishing what her notes referred to only as the continuity program, a structure built with the explicit purpose of preserving the accumulated skill and knowledge of exceptional hunters beyond their natural lifespans, using the Ashkarn blade as one of several vessels designed for exactly that function. Several vessels, Ren repeated slowly. The sword isn't the only one, Farrell said. Corin's notes reference at least 2 others, though she never confirmed their current locations before she died. The program's original intent, as far as she could reconstruct it, wasn't malicious in its founding documents. It was framed as a preservation effort, a way to ensure that the district's most valuable hunters' abilities wouldn't simply be lost to death the way they normally would. But somewhere along the way, preservation apparently stopped waiting for hunters to die naturally, and started arranging for it instead, whenever a suitable candidate's abilities were judged valuable enough to be worth harvesting deliberately. Ren sat with that for a long moment, the tea house's ordinary noise fading into background static while he processed the shape of what Farrell was describing. Not one corrupt official. Not even one corrupt institution acting alone within a single district. A program, over a century old, deliberately designed and apparently still actively maintained, treating exceptional hunters as a renewable resource to be harvested rather than people to be protected. Why tell me this now? Ren asked. Why not 15 years ago, before Corin died, or in the years since? Because I didn't have anyone who could survive long enough to act on it, Farrell said simply. Corin found the origins but never lived to test whether a harvested vessel could actually be understood or controlled by its current wielder. Every wielder after her died too fast, too confused, exactly the way the program intended. You're the first person the program has fed into that sword who's figured out what it is, survived multiple engineered attempts on your life since figuring it out, and started actively building capability from what you found instead of simply being consumed by it. He leaned forward slightly. That makes you something the program's original design never accounted for, Ren. A vessel that woke up before it was supposed to. The word settled into Ren with a strange, cold clarity, the shape of everything he'd discovered over the past weeks finally organizing itself into something he could actually act on rather than simply react to, and beneath the fear that came with understanding the true scale of what he was up against, he felt something else too, quiet and steady. The same settled resolve that had carried him through the ceremony's humiliation and every engineered danger since. What happens, Ren said slowly, if I keep doing exactly what I've been doing? Getting stronger. Building synthesis techniques. Refusing to die quietly. Farrell considered the question carefully before answering. I think the program has never had to plan for that outcome before, because it's never happened before. Which means whatever Castellan does next won't be following an established protocol. He'll be improvising, and improvising against a program built on quiet, careful, decades-long patience is not a position people in his role are used to being in. He paused. It also means you should assume he's no longer working alone in deciding what to do about you. A program old enough to survive multiple changes of leadership almost certainly has more than one active officeholder involved in maintaining it, and if Castellan feels the arrangement genuinely threatened, he'll likely bring others into the decision rather than risk making a mistake by himself. Ren left the tea house that evening with Corin Vast's data drive tucked carefully away and a considerably clearer, considerably more dangerous understanding of exactly what he'd stumbled into, and as he walked the darkening streets back toward his apartment, sword weight settling familiar against his hip, he found himself thinking not about the 11 names archived inside the blade, nor even about Corin Vast's 15 years of buried research, but about Farrell's final observation, turning it over carefully in his mind. A vessel that woke up before it was supposed to. He didn't know yet what the program would do about that. But he understood, with the same patient certainty that had carried him through every discovery so far, that whatever came next would no longer be a quiet, deniable accident easily dismissed as unfortunate field circumstances. Castellan's silence over the last 3 days hadn't been retreat. It had been the sound of a century-old machine recalculating how to respond to the first piece that had ever refused to simply be consumed by it, and Ren intended to make very sure that by the time it finished recalculating, he would already be several steps ahead of whatever it decided to do. Want to see what happens next? Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next part.